Ma'am, the service entrance is around the back. The words landed colder than the rain outside. Naomi Carter stopped just inside the revolving glass doors, tiny drops of water sliding from the edge of her charcoal coat onto the polished marble floor. For a moment, she said nothing. The downtown Charlotte lobby smelled like fresh coffee, lemon polish, and expensive perfume, the kind designed to make people feel important the second they walked in. Behind the front desk, Emily Dawson barely looked up from her monitor as she adjusted the silver bracelet around her wrist. Her voice carried the polished sharpness of someone who had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't. Naomi tightened her grip around the leather folder tucked beneath her arm and glanced toward the wall-sized digital screen displaying red stock numbers falling in real time. Hale and Mercer Technologies was bleeding money by the minute. Employees crossed the lobby in tense silence, their dress shoes clicking against the stone floors like nervous metronomes. Somewhere overhead, thunder rolled across the gray North Carolina sky. "I'm here for a meeting," Naomi said calmly. Emily finally looked up fully, her eyes moving over Naomi's rain-speckled curls, simple pearl earrings, and modest coat that lacked any designer logo she recognized. The pause lasted just long enough to become insulting. "Do you have an employee badge?" Emily asked. "No." "Then visitors need to check in through the kiosk." Naomi stepped toward the touchscreen stand near the desk, but the screen flashed red the second she typed her name. "System temporarily offline." Emily sighed dramatically before leaning back into her chair. "Look, ma'am, executives are very busy today. If you're delivering documents, mail services use the loading dock." Naomi's expression never changed, but something old flickered quietly behind her eyes. She had seen this look before. Hotels, banks, private schools, country clubs, places where silence always came before humiliation. Outside, rainwater streamed down the 40-story glass tower, blurring the city lights into streaks of silver and white. Naomi reached into her folder and removed a business card, setting it gently on the counter between them. Emily glanced down for barely half a second before pushing it back with one manicured finger. "I can't let people wander upstairs without authorization." Two men in tailored suits waiting near the elevators exchanged quick looks before returning to their phones. A young intern nearby lowered his voice and whispered something that made another employee smirk. Naomi noticed all of it. She always did. But her posture remained steady, shoulders relaxed, chin level. Calm had become a form of survival years ago. "The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock, she said softly. Emily checked the silver watch on her wrist and gave a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Well, it's already 9:12. Another crack of thunder rattled faintly through the glass walls. Somewhere deeper inside the building, phones rang nonstop. A television mounted above the reception area displayed breaking news banners beside falling stock charts. Hale and Mercer stock had dropped another 11% since opening bell. Naomi glanced once more at the screen, then toward the elevators. She knew exactly what was happening upstairs. Board members panicking, lawyers stalling, investors circling like sharks around a sinking ship. And she also knew something nobody in that lobby understood yet. Without her signature today, the company wouldn't survive the month. Emily folded her arms. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside unless you have proof of an appointment." For the first time, silence spread across the lobby. Even the elevator chime seemed louder now. Naomi slowly picked up her business card from the counter, careful not to bend the edges. Tiny raindrops shimmered across the embossed lettering beneath the bright chandelier light. Then she slipped the card back into her folder, turned toward the glass doors, and quietly said, "I understand." The rain had eased into a cold mist by the time Naomi stepped back onto the crowded Charlotte sidewalk. Yellow taxi lights reflected across the wet pavement, while steam rose from a street vent near the curb, curling through the gray morning air like smoke. Behind her, the glass tower stretched into the clouds, sharp and distant, as if the building itself had decided who mattered long before anyone walked through the doors. Naomi paused beneath the awning across the street and adjusted the strap of her leather bag against her shoulder. Traffic rolled past in slow waves, tires hissing over rainwater. She could still hear the receptionist's voice in her head, polished and dismissive. "Employees only. Delivery entrance is around the back." It was almost funny how predictable people became the moment they thought you had no power. A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the smell of rain, diesel fuel, and roasted coffee from the cafe beside her. Naomi glanced through the cafe window where office workers crowded around laptops and paper cups, unaware that an entire corporation was balancing on the edge of collapse less than a block away. Her phone vibrated softly inside her coat pocket. She already knew who it was before checking the screen. Richard Hale. Third call in 12 minutes. She let it ring. Not out of anger. Not revenge. Just silence. Silence had taught her more about people than confrontation ever could. Across the intersection, giant digital billboards flashed financial headlines in bright red letters. Hale and Mercer stock continues free fall. Analysts predict emergency buyout. Naomi looked away after a moment. 20 years ago, headlines like that would have excited her. Back then she had believed intelligence alone could open doors. She had been 24, sitting in crowded lecture halls at Howard University with a legal pad balanced on her knees and dreams too large for the apartment she shared with her mother. She still remembered studying market reports at a laundromat, while her mother folded uniforms after double shifts cleaning office buildings nobody ever noticed her inside. Naomi learned early that powerful people rarely looked directly at the workers wiping fingerprints from their glass walls. Especially not black women. Another vibration buzzed through her phone. Fourth missed call. She slipped the device back into her pocket untouched. A city bus roared past, spraying mist onto the sidewalk. Naomi stepped farther beneath the awning and watched droplets slide from the edge of her sleeve. Her coat was simple by design. No luxury labels. No jewelry except the tiny pearl earrings her mother gave her before she died. Naomi could afford private jets now if she wanted them. Instead, she still carried the same quiet habits survival had carved into her years ago. Underestimate me first. Then I know exactly who you are. The cafe door opened beside her, and an older white man in a construction jacket glanced toward the tower across the street. Crazy day for those people in there, he muttered casually while stirring sugar into his coffee. Naomi gave a small polite nod. Looks that way. My nephew works upstairs, the man continued. Says if some investor does not sign today, half that company is done for. Naomi looked back toward the building again, her expression unreadable. Hundreds of employees. Retirement accounts. Families. Assistants skipping breakfast because they were afraid of losing jobs they could not replace. All of it hanging by a thread while a receptionist worried more about appearances than names. Somewhere high above the clouds, thunder rolled again. Naomi slowly reached into her bag and removed the business card Emily had pushed back across the desk. The edges were still damp from rain. Carter Equity Group. Chief Executive Officer. She stared at the embossed black lettering for a long moment before sliding it back into the folder. Then, across the street, the massive glass doors of Hale and Mercer suddenly burst open. Richard Hale nearly slipped on the wet marble steps as he rushed out of the building without his umbrella. "Miss Carter," he shouted across the street, his voice sharp with panic. Several pedestrians turned immediately. Naomi looked up slowly from beneath the awning while cold wind pushed rain against the side of her coat. Richard crossed the street faster than a man in his tailored Italian shoes should have been able to move. By the time he reached her, his breathing had turned uneven, his gray suit dampened at the shoulders from the rain. Behind him, through the massive glass walls of the tower lobby, employees had begun gathering near the windows. Curious faces, nervous faces. Emily stood frozen behind the reception desk, her complexion draining of color with every passing second. Richard pressed one hand against his chest, trying to steady his breath. "Miss Carter, I am so sorry," he said quickly. "There has clearly been a misunderstanding." Naomi studied him calmly for a moment while the city noise moved around them in blurred waves of car horns and rushing tires. "A misunderstanding," she repeated softly. Richard glanced nervously toward the lobby behind him before lowering his voice. "The board has been waiting for you upstairs." Naomi said nothing. Rainwater slid from the edge of the awning beside her, tapping steadily against the sidewalk like a clock counting down the final seconds of something important. Richard swallowed hard. Without this acquisition, the company is finished. Those words hung heavily between them. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true. Naomi had already reviewed the numbers 3 weeks earlier from her office overlooking Manhattan. Hale and Mercer had expanded too aggressively into artificial intelligence contracts. burned through investor confidence, and buried themselves beneath debt disguised as growth. The company had less than 60 days before lenders started circling publicly. Richard knew it. The board knew it. Wall Street definitely knew it. But most of the employees inside that building still believed everything would somehow recover on its own. Naomi looked past him through the glass tower entrance. Emily stood completely motionless now, one hand pressed lightly against the reception counter as if steadying herself. The same woman who had dismissed her less than 15 minutes earlier now looked terrified to even meet her eyes. Naomi had seen this transformation before too. Confidence turning into fear the second power changed direction. "I tried to check in," Naomi said quietly. Richard closed his eyes for half a second, shame flashing across his face. "I know. Your receptionist seemed more concerned with appearances than appointments." His jaw tightened immediately. "She will be dealt with." Naomi's expression remained unreadable. A city bus rolled past behind them, spraying another thin mist of rainwater along the curb. Somewhere overhead, thunder groaned again across the Carolina sky. Richard adjusted the cuff of his soaked sleeve and lowered his voice even more. "Ms. Carter, there are over 2,000 employees tied to this company nationwide. Manufacturing teams, software divisions, customer service centers. Families." Naomi watched him carefully now. Not because of the deal, because of the fear. Real fear sounded different from corporate performance. It became quieter, smaller, human. Richard continued, "I know today started badly, but I am asking you personally to come upstairs." Through the lobby windows, more employees had begun noticing the scene unfolding outside. Whispers spread across the marble floor in visible ripples. One security guard straightened his posture immediately after realizing who Naomi actually was. Emily still had not moved. Naomi slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed her phone. 11 missed calls. 7 text messages. 1 voicemail marked urgent. Richard's eyes followed the screen briefly before dropping toward the sidewalk. "I should have come downstairs myself," he admitted. "That was my mistake." Naomi looked at him for another long silent moment while rain tapped softly against the awning above them. Then she slid the phone back into her pocket and asked one quiet question. "Mr. Hale, if I walked away right now, would anyone in that building understand why?" Richard did not answer immediately, because he knew the truth. Most of them would only understand the loss after it was already too late. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Rain drifted sideways through the cold morning wind while traffic lights reflected red and gold across the soaked pavement between them. Naomi stood beneath the awning with one hand resting lightly against the strap of her leather bag, her expression calm enough to make Richard even more nervous. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, survived hostile shareholder meetings, and once testified before a Senate committee without breaking eye contact. But this felt different, because this time the entire future of his company depended on whether one woman chose to forgive a humiliation she never should have experienced in the first place. Behind the lobby windows, employees pretended not to stare. Some held coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths. Others whispered while glancing toward Emily at the reception desk. She looked smaller now somehow. Smaller than she had 15 minutes ago when she controlled access to the building with clipped smiles and polished indifference. Naomi finally looked up toward the top of the glass tower disappearing into the clouds. "When my mother cleaned office buildings," she said quietly, "people used to stop talking when she walked into the room." Richard listened without interrupting. "Not because they respected her," Naomi continued, "because they assumed she was invisible." The city noise faded behind her voice. Even the rain seemed quieter somehow. Naomi's eyes remained fixed on the building across the street. "She used to tell me something every night after work." Richard waited. She said, "Never let other people decide your value before you even speak." A long silence followed. Richard lowered his gaze briefly toward the sidewalk, water collecting around the polished edges of his shoes. Naomi had not raised her voice once. That made the shame worse. Angry people could be argued with. Calm people forced you to hear yourself clearly. A black SUV pulled up near the curb beside the tower entrance, but nobody moved toward it. All attention remained fixed across the street. Naomi slowly exhaled and glanced once more through the glass lobby doors. Emily finally looked away the second their eyes nearly met. "Do you know what the strange thing is?" Naomi asked softly. Richard looked up again. "I was still going to save your company. The words hit harder than accusation ever could. Richard blinked slowly. Ms. Carter, even after she dismissed me, Naomi's voice remained gentle. Even after your employees watched it happen and said nothing. Wind rattled the awning overhead. Somewhere farther downtown, a siren echoed briefly before disappearing into the rain. Richard rubbed a hand across his jaw, exhaustion finally visible beneath the polished executive image he carried so carefully upstairs. You are right, he admitted quietly. There is no excuse for what happened. Naomi studied him for another moment. Then she stepped away from the wall beneath the awning and walked toward the crosswalk. Richard immediately followed beside her without speaking. Traffic paused as they crossed the slick street together. Water rippled beneath Naomi's shoes with each measured step. Inside the lobby, employees straightened instinctively as the doors opened. Warm air swept over them, carrying the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. The marble floors gleamed beneath towering chandeliers overhead. Naomi entered calmly, neither rushed nor dramatic, but the atmosphere changed instantly the moment she walked inside. Conversation stopped. Elevator chimes echoed loudly through the silence. Emily stood frozen behind the reception desk, her face pale beneath the bright lobby lights. One of the security guards quickly stepped aside to clear the path toward the elevators. Naomi paused near the front desk for only a second. Her eyes settled gently on the business card still lying beside Emily's keyboard where it had been discarded earlier. Rain had curled one corner slightly. Naomi reached down, picked it up carefully between two fingers, and smoothed the edge flat against her palm. Emily opened her mouth as if trying to speak, but no words came out. Naomi looked at her quietly, not with anger, not even triumph, just disappointment. Then she slid the card back into her folder and walked toward the elevators while every person in the lobby watched in complete silence. The elevator climbed in near silence, smooth and fast, the soft mechanical hum filling the space between Naomi and Richard while floor numbers flashed upward one after another in pale white light. 41, 42, 43. Richard loosened his tie slightly for the first time all morning, but the movement did little to ease the tension sitting across his shoulders. Naomi stood calmly beside him, one hand resting lightly against her folder, rainwater still darkening the edge of her coat sleeve. The mirrored elevator walls reflected them both back in distorted fragments. A tired executive with a company hanging by a thread, and the woman everyone downstairs had mistaken for someone unimportant. When the doors finally opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere changed instantly. The hallway smelled faintly of espresso, printer toner, and polished walnut wood. Assistants looked up from tablets the moment Naomi stepped out beside Richard. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One young analyst nearly dropped the stack of financial reports he was carrying. Through the glass conference room walls ahead, nearly a dozen board members sat around a long black table covered in spreadsheets, coffee cups, and open laptops glowing with red market numbers. Anxiety lived in every face inside that room. Richard paused near the entrance and turned toward Naomi carefully. Before we go in, he said quietly, I want you to know I truly am sorry. Naomi looked at him for a moment, but gave only a small nod. Not forgiveness, not rejection, just acknowledgement. Richard pushed open the conference room doors. Every head turned immediately. Several executives rose halfway from their chairs the second they recognized Naomi Carter walking into the room. A woman near the end of the table exhaled so sharply it almost sounded like relief. Ms. Carter, one board member said quickly, thank you for coming. Naomi stepped inside without rushing. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched behind the conference table, revealing downtown Charlotte buried beneath gray rain clouds. Thunder rolled softly in the distance while droplets streaked across the glass 70 stories above the streets below. At the center of the table sat thick acquisition binders marked confidential beside financial summaries no longer worth pretending looked healthy. Naomi noticed everything immediately. Sleepless eyes, empty coffee cups, fingers tapping nervously against polished wood. One executive had loosened his collar so much it looked like he had forgotten it entirely. Fear left traces on people, no matter how expensive the room was. Richard pulled out a chair near the head of the table for Naomi himself. That alone changed the energy inside the room. Executives who once measured power by titles and office size now watched one woman determine whether their futures survived the day. Naomi sat gracefully and placed her folder in front of her. Across the table, an older board member cleared his throat carefully. We reviewed the revised terms from Carter Equity at 6 this morning. Naomi folded her hands lightly together. And the man hesitated. We are prepared to accept them. A faint silence followed. Naomi opened the folder slowly, revealing organized documents marked with handwritten notes in dark blue ink. You should be, she replied calmly. Your previous debt structure would have collapsed within 18 months even if market conditions improved. Nobody argued. Because she was right. A younger executive near the far end shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Our projections showed stabilization by third quarter next year. Naomi glanced toward him gently. Your projections also ignored supply chain exposure in Arizona and overestimated government contract renewals by almost 40%. The room went completely still. She did not raise her voice. She did not humiliate anyone. But truth had its own weight when spoken clearly. Naomi slid one financial report across the table. I did not come here to embarrass anyone, she said softly. I came because thousands of employees deserve better leadership than panic disguised as optimism. Richard lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished table surface. Outside the conference room windows, rain continued falling across the city in long silver streaks, while deep below them the world kept moving completely unaware that an entire company had just begun realizing who had really walked through their lobby that morning. The meeting stretched deep into the afternoon, while rain continued washing across the city outside the towering conference room windows. At some point, the thunder faded and the sky softened from dark gray into the pale silver light that comes just before evening. Coffee grew cold beside untouched laptops. Financial projections covered the massive table in neat stacks of paper marked with red annotations from Naomi's careful handwriting. One by one, the panic that had filled the room earlier slowly transformed into something quieter. Focus, clarity, hope. Naomi stood near the windows now, reviewing the final acquisition terms while the board members spoke in lower, calmer voices behind her. Below the tower, Charlotte traffic moved through wet streets glowing beneath reflections of neon signs and headlights. Tiny people hurried along sidewalks with umbrellas tilted against the drizzle, unaware how close thousands of jobs had come to disappearing before lunchtime. Richard watched Naomi from across the room for a long moment before finally stepping closer. You have done more for this company in 4 hours than we managed in the last 6 months, he admitted quietly. Naomi kept her eyes on the rain sliding down the glass. Numbers tell the truth eventually, she said softly. Most people just wait too long to listen. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the window beside the city lights below. Richard noticed how still she remained even after everything that had happened downstairs. No bitterness, no performance, just composure. It unsettled him in a way anger never could. Behind them, several board members had already begun discussing recovery plans with cautious optimism returning to their voices. Earlier that morning, the same room had felt like a funeral wrapped in expensive suits. Now the air felt lighter somehow. Not because the problems were gone. Because someone had finally chosen honesty over ego. Naomi closed the folder in her hands and rested it lightly against the window ledge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence inside the conference room felt different now. Softer. Human. Richard loosened his tie completely and glanced toward the city below. Can I ask you something? Naomi turned slightly toward him. Why did you still come upstairs? The question lingered between them quietly. Richard looked genuinely confused by his own curiosity. After the way you were treated downstairs, he continued, most people would have walked away. Naomi's gaze drifted back toward the rain outside. Maybe, she said. But walking away would not only hurt the people responsible. The room behind them blurred softly beneath the reflection of city lights across the glass. Naomi folded her arms lightly against the coolness of the window. There is a woman in accounting on the 19th floor worrying about daycare bills tonight, she said quietly. There is a warehouse employee in Phoenix trying to keep health insurance for his son. There is probably an intern downstairs praying this company survives long enough for her first real promotion. Richard listened carefully. Naomi's voice never rose above calm conversation, but every word landed with quiet weight. People at the top make mistakes, she continued. But regular employees pay for them first. Rain tapped gently against the windows 70 stories above the streets below. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment, absorbing the truth inside her words. All day he had focused on debt, contracts, investors, headlines. Naomi had been thinking about people. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Across the room, one of the executives laughed softly for the first time all day after receiving updated market projections from an analyst. The sound felt almost unfamiliar in the space. Naomi glanced toward the table briefly before looking back outside again. My mother used to clean buildings like this, she said after a pause. She would come home exhausted every night and still remind me not to let bitterness become my personality. Richard smiled faintly, tired but genuine. She sounds remarkable. Naomi nodded once. She was. Evening light spread slowly across the skyline, while the storm clouds finally began to break apart beyond the city. And for the first time since Naomi walked through the front doors that morning, the silence around them no longer felt cold. By 6:30 that evening, the storm had finally passed over Charlotte. Golden light from the setting sun spilled across the skyline and poured through the towering conference room windows in soft reflections, warming the cold glass and polished black table that had held nothing but panic earlier that morning. The final acquisition documents now sat signed and neatly stacked beside Naomi's folder. Phones across the executive floor buzzed nonstop with updates from investors, financial outlets, and market analysts reacting to the news that Hale and Mercer had survived. The company's stock, once collapsing by the minute, had already begun climbing again. Relief moved through the building like oxygen returning after hours underwater. Employees smiled cautiously in hallways. Assistants whispered excitedly beside elevators. Somewhere downstairs, somebody had even ordered food for the entire accounting department. Naomi stood near the windows alone for a moment, watching the city glow beneath streaks of orange and fading blue light. Reflections from nearby towers shimmered across the glass like moving water. Behind her, board members slowly gathered their laptops and legal folders, their exhaustion softened now by gratitude and disbelief. Richard approached quietly with 2 paper coffee cups in his hands. I figured after today, he said gently, offering one toward her. You deserved something warmer than rain. Naomi accepted the cup with a faint smile. Thank you. The coffee smelled rich and dark, carrying hints of cinnamon from the cafe downstairs. Richard leaned lightly against the edge of the conference table beside her. You know, he admitted, half this board thought we were finished before you walked in. Naomi looked down into the steam rising from the cup. You were close. Richard laughed softly under his breath, not offended because honesty no longer sounded threatening coming from her. Across the room, several executives thanked Naomi again before quietly leaving one by one. The giant conference room slowly emptied until only the distant hum of computers and the city below remained. Then a hesitant knock sounded at the open doorway. Naomi turned slightly. Emily stood there. Gone was the polished confidence from earlier that morning. Her posture looked smaller now, uncertain beneath the bright overhead lights. She held a thin folder tightly against her chest with both hands. Richard's expression hardened instantly the moment he saw her. Emily, he said sharply. This is not the time. No, Naomi said softly before he could continue. It is fine. Emily stepped inside carefully, her heels clicking quietly against the polished floor. She looked at Naomi directly for the first time all day, and the guilt in her face was impossible to hide. Ms. Carter, she said, her voice uneven, I wanted to apologize. Silence settled gently around the room. Emily swallowed hard before continuing. What I did downstairs was wrong. I made assumptions about you before I even asked your name. Naomi listened calmly without interrupting. Evening sunlight brushed softly across the side of Emily's face, catching the edge of tears she was clearly trying to hold back. I embarrassed myself, Emily admitted quietly. But more than that, I embarrassed this company. Richard crossed his arms, but remained silent now. Emily lowered her eyes briefly toward the floor. I know saying sorry does not erase it, she continued. But I truly am. Naomi studied her for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with superiority. Just thoughtfulness. Finally, she set the coffee cup down beside her folder and stepped closer. Do you know the dangerous thing about assumptions? Naomi asked gently. Emily looked up slowly. Eventually they stopped being thoughts, Naomi continued. and start becoming habits. The room fell completely still. Naomi's voice remained soft, but every word landed clearly in the quiet space between them. People can recover from mistakes, she said, but only if they are willing to see them honestly. Emily nodded faintly, tears finally slipping free despite her effort to hide them. Richard exhaled slowly beside the window, his posture easing for the first time all day. Outside, the last light of sunset stretched across Charlotte in gold reflections, while deep below the tower, thousands of ordinary people continued walking through the city, completely unaware that one woman's quiet dignity had just changed the atmosphere inside an entire building. The executive floor had almost emptied by the time Naomi finally stepped out of the conference room. The sky beyond the massive windows had deepened into rich shades of navy blue and amber, and the city lights below Charlotte shimmered across rain-dark streets like scattered gold coins. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter drifted slowly across the skyline while traffic moved steadily beneath the glow of office towers and restaurant signs beginning to fill with evening crowds. Naomi walked quietly down the hallway with her leather folder tucked beneath one arm, her heels making soft, measured sounds against the polished floor. The tension from earlier had dissolved into exhaustion now, the kind that settles into a building after surviving a crisis nobody outside will ever fully understand. As she approached the elevator lobby, she noticed someone already waiting there. Emily stood near the windows with her coat folded carefully over one arm and a small cardboard box balanced against her hip. The reception desk nameplate rested inside beside framed photos, pens, and a half-empty coffee mug. Naomi slowed slightly, but did not stop walking. Emily turned the moment she heard the footsteps. Her eyes looked tired, red around the edges from crying she clearly did not want anyone to see. "Mr. Hale let me go," she admitted quietly before Naomi could speak. Naomi glanced briefly toward the box in her arms. "I figured." Emily lowered her eyes. "Honestly, I probably deserved it." The elevator lights reflected softly across the glass walls behind them. Naomi studied the young woman for a moment. Earlier that morning, Emily had looked polished and untouchable behind her marble reception desk. Now she looked like what she actually was underneath all the corporate confidence. Young, human, afraid. "Do you have children?" Naomi asked gently. Emily blinked, surprised by the question. "A daughter," she answered softly. "She is 6. Naomi nodded once. "What is her name?" "Lily." The name lingered quietly between them. Emily tightened her grip slightly around the cardboard box. "I kept thinking all afternoon," she admitted. "What if someone treated her someday the way I treated you this morning?" Naomi looked toward the city lights outside before answering. "Then teach her better." Emily swallowed hard, emotion catching briefly in her throat. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, but neither woman stepped inside yet. Naomi reached into her folder slowly and removed a thin white envelope. "There is a leadership program in Atlanta," she said calmly, handing it toward Emily. "Customer relations and management training." Emily stared down at the envelope in confusion. "I do not understand." "Your termination package will include a recommendation from me," Naomi explained softly. Emily's eyes widened immediately. "Why would you do that after what happened?" Naomi's expression remained calm beneath the warm elevator lights. "Because humiliation teaches fear," she said quietly. "But grace teaches people how to change." The silence that followed felt almost sacred somehow. Emily looked down at the envelope in her hands as tears slipped silently down her cheeks again. Naomi stepped into the elevator then, pressing the lobby button beside the glowing panel. Just before the doors closed, Emily spoke one last time. "Ms. Carter." Naomi looked up. "Thank you," Emily whispered. Naomi gave the faintest nod. "Make sure your daughter grows up seeing people clearly." Then the elevator doors slid shut between them with a soft mechanical whisper. As Naomi descended through the glowing tower, floor numbers dropping steadily one by one, she watched her reflection in the mirrored walls beside her. Calm eyes, damp curls from the morning rain, pearl earrings catching soft golden light. She looked exactly the same as she had when she first walked into the building hours earlier. The only difference was that now the people inside finally understood who they had been looking at all along. 3 months later, the lobby of Hale and Mercer looked different. The cold tension that once lived inside the towering glass building had softened into something warmer, quieter, more human. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows in long golden beams that stretched across the polished marble floors, catching reflections from coffee cups, elevator doors, and the steady movement of employees beginning another workday. The giant stock ticker mounted along the lobby wall now glowed green instead of red. Analysts on television screens spoke about one of the strongest corporate recoveries of the year. Investors praised the restructuring strategy. Financial magazines called it a miracle turnaround. But the employees inside the building knew the truth was simpler than headlines. Somebody had finally chosen integrity over ego. Naomi Carter stepped through the revolving doors just after 9 in the morning, wearing the same calm expression she always carried. Her charcoal coat rested neatly over one arm now, revealing a simple cream-colored blouse beneath. Conversations softened the moment people recognized her. Not out of fear this time. Respect. A young security guard near the entrance straightened immediately and opened the interior glass doors for her with a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Carter." Naomi smiled warmly in return. "Morning." The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries from the cafe, now operating beside the elevators. Employees moved with lighter energy than they had months earlier. Some nodded respectfully as Naomi passed. Others quietly thanked her without slowing their steps. Near the reception desk stood a new nameplate, Daniel Reyes. The young receptionist behind the counter looked up from his computer with an easy professional smile. "Good morning, Miss Carter. Mr. Hale is expecting you upstairs." Naomi nodded politely before her eyes drifted toward something sitting near the edge of the marble desk. A framed photograph. A little girl with curly brown hair and missing front teeth grinned brightly beside a woman Naomi recognized immediately. Emily. Naomi paused for only a second before stepping toward the elevators. "Miss Carter," Daniel called gently. Naomi turned. "There is something here for you." He handed her a small white envelope with careful hands. Naomi opened it slowly inside the quiet elevator as the doors slid closed around her. Inside was a handwritten card. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become someone my daughter can be proud of. The leadership program changed my life. Lily starts first grade next week. I think about your words every day. Emily." Naomi looked down at the card while the elevator climbed smoothly upward through the building. Soft instrumental music played quietly overhead. Her reflection shimmered in the mirrored walls beside her, calm and thoughtful beneath the warm morning light. By the time the elevator reached the executive floor, she had folded the note carefully back into the envelope. Richard waited near the conference room entrance holding a tablet beneath one arm. "You are smiling," he observed with quiet amusement as she approached. Naomi slipped the envelope gently into her purse. "Someone decided to grow." Richard nodded slowly, understanding more than she actually said. Together they walked past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bright Charlotte skyline, stretching endlessly beneath clear blue skies. The storm from that morning months ago felt impossibly far away now. Inside the conference room, employees prepared presentations and financial reports with renewed confidence, but Naomi paused briefly before entering. Her eyes drifted toward the lobby far below where tiny figures moved across shining marble floors under streams of sunlight. For a moment, she simply stood there silently, one hand resting lightly against the envelope in her purse while morning light warmed the glass beside her. Then, with the quiet grace that had carried her through every room people once told her she did not belong in, Naomi Carter stepped forward and disappeared into the future she had built without ever losing herself along the way.